Okay, we're starting with our ID notes on reptiles. So I've got my notebook set up. I have my line slightly left of center, so I'm going to write my animal names on the left-hand side, and I'll write the characteristics and perhaps draw some pictures on the right-hand side. These are our ID notes for reptiles. So we've got ID notes for reptiles. Make sure your name, date, and session is in the right-hand side of your paper. All right, so the first reptile we're going to look at are iguanas. So we have iguanas. Main characteristics, some of the cool things, there are 35 different species of iguanas. A lifespan is about 15 to 20 years in captivity. Something that's notable about their characteristics or their features is their stocky structure, or stocky stature. So they're very short into the ground. They also have some saggy skin on their throats and spines protruding along their heads, necks, backs, and tails. So they definitely look prehistoric with those spines, and then they have that skin flap on their throat. So here we have what we might think of as a typical iguana in captivity, and we have that skin flap right down there, and it's even laying on the sides. You see how bright and orange it is, and then all of those spines along the backside. Now, iguanas have a pretty keen sense of smell, and they get very, very large, those that we tend to have in the pet trade, and they actually do not make great pets for females because of that smell, and they can become very aggressive with their owners, and their tail is a very powerful whip, and so that's their weapon. They will whip you with their tail before they try to bite you. So they can be very dangerous and they're very large. The next animal we're going to look at is the gecko. So we've got our gecko. Now, in the classroom, we have leopard geckos, but there's actually over 1,500 species of geckos. So that is definitely a lot of different species we've got out there. Lifespan is very variable, so it just depends on what species in captivity, out of captivity. Something that's really notable about them is that they are able to drop their tail, and this is called atomize their tails. So they do drop it. If a leopard gecko or any type of gecko drops their tail, it is definitely not as pretty the second time it grows back, and it may never grow back to the fullness that it once was. The tail with geckos is pretty nifty because it's their fat reserve. So you might see a gecko that has a super thin tail. So here I've got a thin tail, which means I don't have that much fat reserves, but some of your geckos, like our leopard gecko in the classroom, that tail will fluff up because that's where it's holding onto its fat. So if it needs to go without eating, it can. This particular gecko in the picture has his little foot pads, so you can see on the sides of the toes, so it can climb up on trees and upside down and things with the friction. Leopard geckos cannot. They have more just claw-like toes. Next is we have a chameleon. So chameleons are one of those pets that some people will have them. They're very, very high maintenance chameleons, so they require a lot of humidity and just a lot of specialized care. So they are a little bit harder to take care of if you are looking at reptiles as pets. Number of species, about 171 different species. Lifespan again varies in captivity about 2 to 10 years, really depending partly on the species, but also they are susceptible to different diseases and things, and humans not necessarily taking care of them as well as they need to be. So something cool that's interesting with your chameleons is that they have nerve impulses and hormone changes that actually cause that color to change. And the color of the cells, it's in 4 different layers of their skin that's actually changing. So how this works is the cells expand or they shrink, and they are able to then change that color. And then the blending of the different layers creates the colors and the patterns that we see. So It's all how that light is getting reflected off of those cells. And by changing that size, it changes how that light reflects and then therefore changes the colors that we see. When we see chameleons, they should be nice and bright. When we start to see them turn black or darker in color, that's definitely a sign of stress. And so we want to make sure that we take them to a veterinarian as soon as we see those types of things and double check all of the humidity levels, the temperature, the feed, what are you feeding it as well. So if you do see drastic, like very pale colors or darkening, you want to definitely kind of see what's going on with your animal. Next, we have our bearded dragons. These would probably be one of the best lizards to have. If you're going to have a lizard for, or even any type of reptile, for a pet, bearded dragons are some of the best. So there's 9 subspecies of bearded dragon. They are from Australia. So they are found in Australia, which is pretty cool. Their lifespan is about 6 to 10 years in captivity. Notable is that they do have that color change in the neck area is only linked to social interactions, and they can change their back's color depending on the temperature. And that is your British way of saying color or spelling it, just in case you're like, what? Yeah, so that is the British way of spelling color, or the British English. Um, so they will change. They'll become a little bit darker if they're cooler. So that way, if they're becoming darker and they're cool, right, they're trying to trap in more of that sun because the sun is going to be attracted to that more dark color. It's going to absorb better. We know Gunner will change his beard all the way to black. Females have a bit of ability to go a little orange and slightly black, but not nearly as black as the males are able to. So here we have a group of bearded dragons right there. Next, something that's important to note when we're talking about reptiles is a UVB light. This is where many of us, as reptile owners, we lose the mark, right? Or we forget something, and that is the UVB light. So the UVB light allows the synthesis of vitamin D3, which is going to help our animals absorb calcium, and they need calcium for their bones, right? So they need to be able to absorb that calcium when they're eating. This is also why we're going to provide vitamin powder for our animals too. So when you're feeding reptiles, for lizards, and you're going to make sure that you do shake up some different powders and vitamins onto their food to make sure that they're getting everything they need. Lizards are considered ectotherms, so we kind of talked about this in class. So ecto is outside. Therms, when I'm talking about therm, I'm talking about the temperature. So these are animals that cannot regulate their internal body temperature. So their body temperature is dependent on the environment that they're in. So when I go to the vet, I'm not necessarily going to take the temperature of a bearded dragon or a ball python when I get there, because I know the temperature is going to be whatever the room temperature is. But these facilities will have heated cages. So that's going to be something that's a little different when you're going into a hospital that specializes in reptiles or ectotherms, is that their enclosures will all they all will have heated elements in them to make sure that they can regulate that heat if needed to keep the animal. And then we've got our heat lamps. So our heat lamp is providing that heat, right? So it is that bulb that's going to be mainly heat rather than light. And it's used as that heat source. Now you see a lot of different bulbs on the market that are actually a light, or like a white light or a red light. In our classroom, we use ceramic heat bulbs just because it's a more concentrated heat. And then we have our daylight bulbs. So for the classroom, we use the ceramic, so that way we're not giving off any more light, because they get light from being in the classroom, and then they have their UVB bulbs, which also give off light. So I want to make sure that they have some time where they're actually dark without any light, but still getting their heat source. So ceramic is an option as well. Heat rocks, we want to make sure that we stay away from. Animals, because they're ectotherms, they don't have a really great sense of telling when they're starting to get too hot. So heat rocks can actually burn your reptile because they'll go on it and not realize how hot it is, and then they'll burn themselves. All right. And so then all right, and the next thing is our metabolic bone disease. So, metabolic bone disease is a kind of grouping of different diseases of the bones, but caused by different vitamin deficiencies and things. We find it in reptiles. We find that it's a calcium deficiency is what causes their metabolic bone disease, and it's due to lack of calcium, right? If we use a UVB light, we reduce that risk though. So that's why the UVB light is so important. We also need to make sure that we're actually changing that UVB light every 6 to 12 months. So depending on the manufacturer, you want to make sure you definitely see how many hours you have of that bulb, because even though it's bright, it's not necessarily giving off the UVB rays anymore. So you do need to change those bulbs every 6 to 12 months to make sure that you're still getting that UVB. And it often does infect those reptiles or affect the reptiles that are eating vegetables and insects versus the whole prey. So our snakes, you'll see that we don't have a UVB light in their enclosure. And that's because they are able to get their calcium straight from the meat sources that they're eating. But our animals that are insectivores, those insects really don't have that same level of calcium, right? Because their exoskeletons are made differently versus a snake that eats a rat, and the rat has bones, and those bones are made of calcium. So it's able to kind of resource or repurpose that bone. But if I'm just eating a cricket, this is why you'll hear talk about gut loading crickets, is to make sure that it has the different vitamins in it that the animal needs. And and so we want to make sure that that UVB light is there to prevent that metabolic bone disease from happening.